sadly all good things must come to an end, so let's wrap this up. Today, we're closing out the story of the F-4 Phantom, and we've got a lot to cover, because even after Vietnam was over, this thing was still distributing big parts across the sky, and the US wasn't even doing it. At least not all of it. Even before the war was over, people were still figuring out how to make the Phantom better at turning others to the dark side, better known as the afterlife. The US Navy in particular had so much to think about that they weren't waiting for the war to be over, or even for Christmas to come for that matter, to start getting new toys on the shelf at Freedom R Us. As the war dragged on, the US Navy realized that planes are like people and they seem to age a lot faster when they're always blowing stuff up. The F-4Bs they'd been using since they'd entered service in the 60s were starting to fall apart. And if you're going to extend a platform's life and you've got newer versions of it already running, aka the F-4J, why not just bring them up to the new standard? And that's exactly what they did. After the prototype first flew in June of 1972, the Navy would begin the process of upgrading its F-4Bs into their next form, the F-4Ns.
What do you think of my third form?
These would not only get the standard Super Saiyan F-4J power-up, but they would also be equipped with smokeless engines. Santa Claus has dragged coal dust out of enough chimneys, and he's tired of shedding it everywhere. However, there's a lot of people still on the naughty list who keep dodging their presents, and he's gonna need some upgrades to his delivery process to get them. Those flying Soviet Amazon packages weren't going to open themselves, so Freedom Claus would bring in a little early Christmas surprise and give the Navy the first ever helmet-mounted sight. This tech was basically a gun sight for heat-seeking missiles that would let you shoot them at a target just by looking at it. Not turning in behind it, looking at it. People are sitting here thinking Superman's X-ray vision is cool, and I'm over here like, no. Give me the death vision. The Visual Target Acquisition System, or VTAS, would enter service in March of 1972 with the F-4Js, and when the F-4Ns were upgraded, the system would be integrated onto them as well. These and the updated VTAS-2s, introduced in 1975, would be used on about 500 Phantoms. But they wouldn't even make it through a decade of service because nobody could figure out how to get the missiles to track off of that data. And since you can't have death vision without the whole death part, they're kind of stuck with just the vision part, which they could do perfectly well enough without all that extra weight strapped onto their heads. Since the only purpose it was serving was being a literal giant pain in the neck, the Navy would retire the VTAS in 1979, clearing the way for the Phantom's final form, and arguably its most dangerous variant.
Alrighty then, final form it is.
Uncle Sam's misguided children also had to worry about their well-used F-4Bs after the war had ended, and following its first flight in July of 1977, soon the Marines would receive modernized F-4Js handed down from the Navy, which were dubbed the F-4S. These also came with smokeless engines as well as reinforced airframes and the same leading-edge slots that have been used on the Air Force F-4E, and they make a strong case for being the ultimate American Phantoms. Which honestly feels like the perfect irony. The Marines are one of America's finest blunt instruments, and they're being equipped with the ultimate in flying bricks.
It's not an airplane, Colonel, it's a flying brick.
The Air Force wouldn't be left out in getting new Phantoms either, and in fact, their newest edition had a special role in mind. After the absolute joyride that had been fighting through the air defenses in Vietnam, they all kind of agreed that a dedicated platform would be more effective in the suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD role, than adaptations of existing aircraft. Starting in 1978, they would get the first aircraft ever made specifically for the Wild Weasel mission. 116 F-4Es were refitted into their new F-4G designations, which sacked the internal cannon and replaced it with an AN/APR-38 attack warning system. This electronic warfare kit would use 52 different antennas placed all over the plane to not only pick up on hostile radar frequencies, but to backtrack the direction and range to the radar site. This information would then be fed to either friendly aircraft or its AGM-45 Shrikes and later AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, or HARMs, to be counter-fired against those radar arrays. And the G can still carry AGM-65 Maverick TV-guided missiles, Sparrows, and Sidewinders to handle whatever else it wants. I know I've said it a million times that the Phantom is 3 planes in a trench coat, but at this point this isn't even a plane. This is a Swiss Army knife with a plane attached to it. And while it can only carry 2 Sparrow missiles to make way for jamming pods in the forward slots, the AGM-88 is actually capable of locking onto aircraft. As long as those aircraft are B-52s.
How?
Yeah, apparently there was one case of an F-4G's HARM being fired in its search and destroy mode that mistook a B-52 for a SAM site in Desert Storm, either due to its onboard countermeasure systems or the tail gunner's radar. That HARM would promptly arrive for its scheduled appointment with the B-52's tail, and the 147-pound warhead completely atomized the rear turret, wrecked the tail controls, and ejected the drag chute. The crew actually managed to cancel its follow-up appointment with the ground and limped the B-52 home. So the F-4G now has the only air-to-air intercept with an anti-SAM missile, thankfully a failed one, and after being repaired, the B-52 even got a new paint job and a nickname: In Harm's Way. I swear the dark veteran humor never fails to land. Just like those harms. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. The F-4G and RF-4C Phantoms made it all the way to Desert Storm, and they weren't even falling apart like those of some other countries. The mission capable rate, or MCR, of RF-4Cs only declined from 85% to 78% over the course of the entire conflict. And that's while they were out in the field actively playing their part in what came to be called the Great Scud Hunt. And it would ironically shape up to be a perfect 1-2 Phantom punch. See, RF-4Cs from the Alabama and Nevada National Guards, which had been modernized to carry Sparrow missiles as well, were supposed to go out and find strategic targets like supplies, enemy units, and Scud SAM batteries. And once they found the Scud batteries, then they'd just send in the other Phantoms, the F-4Gs, who would then roll up and remind those surface-to-air missile sites why you should never underestimate the old man in a profession where men die young. Pause, I need you to understand how insane the psychological warfare value of that kind of tactic is. Imagine being an anti-aircraft gunner positioned forwards of the SAM battery somewhere, and you see or hear these Phantoms going overhead day after day after day, and you get no reports of anything exploding, so eventually you just learn to ignore it. And then one day you hear them go overhead like normal, you're not even thinking about it, and minutes later you hear explosions off in the distance. And when you run to your phone line to call back and ask what the heck is happening over there, you just get static, because the enemy also shut down your communication hubs at the same time. How terrifying did it have to be as some random conscript out in the middle of Sandy Cheeks nowhere in that scenario?
This guy's got the right idea. He wore the brown pants.
And frankly, the Phantom didn't even have to be in a fight to make people look up in the sky and ask themselves, what even is today? When the US made the X-15 to test out hypersonic flight performance, a NASA F-4C was used as the chaser plane to keep track of it during flight. And another Phantom would become the precursor to the F-15 SMTD, you know, this freaking monstrosity. And that Phantom, the YF-4E, is a monster in its own right, not only because it's got shark fins sticking out the side, but because it was one of the original YRF-110 prototypes, and renamed the YRF-4C before it was even delivered because of the Tri-Service Designation System. It was later converted to a prototype for the F-4E to test its dogfighting modifications, like those leading-edge slats I mentioned earlier, and it was renamed to the YF-4E on April 20th, 1967. Then it would serve as one of the first testbed platforms for the concept of the fly-by-wire control system. This control system uses electronic wiring and computers to move the flight controls via electric motors instead of driving in manual with hydraulic boosters, and there's a few reasons you'd want to install it. 1, a computer-controlled plane can auto-update the limits on its control outputs to limit the strain on the airframe in peacetime and maximize the plane's lifespan. 2, you can allow an airplane to fly to its maximum flyable limits in combat instead of having to manually guesstimate them and run the risk of causing your plane to have a temper tantrum on its way out of the sky. And 3, it lets you fly aircraft that are aerodynamically unstable, aka they want to have that temper tantrum at every opportunity, and the controls have to make small adjustments constantly to keep it moving where you want it to. You're basically taking one of those leashes you put on the feral child at the mall that you have to tug on periodically to make sure they don't go tear the shelves apart, shove it under the laws of physics, and hope that it's into that. I hope they bought them dinner first. With that system aboard, the YF-4E testbed became the first plane to break Mach 2 with fly-by-wire controls, and that's before they gave it the Megalodon treatment. Adding the canards let the US test the Precision Aircraft Control Technology, or PACT system, which took that fly-by-wire a step further to test different flight surface arrangements and figure out just how many fetishes they could introduce to the atmosphere at once. So between the potential to treat the laws of physics like it's their kinky partner and wage every form of warfare under the sun, or just do a drive-by with the sun, it doesn't really surprise me that no fewer than 11 other countries wanted a cut of the Phantom pie. The first country to acquire the F-4 Phantom's combat prowess was the United Kingdom. Following the cancellation of their advanced aircraft projects from the 1957 Defense White Paper because somebody thought it would be a brilliant idea to defend a small isle with nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missiles that could spread fallout over the whole country, the UK didn't really have a whole lot of options for future carrier-based fleet defense aircraft. So after careful consideration and enough grumbling to make an adolescent teenager look well-behaved, they began working with the US and McDonnell Douglas to create variants of the Phantoms made specifically to sit like a king, overcompensation and all. They would order 2 different variations of the F-4J, one for the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and one for the Royal Air Force. The Royal Navy's F-4K, aka the FG-1, was first delivered in 1968. after spending probably a non-decimal percentage of the country's GDP on it. See, the British didn't want their entire military supply chain to be dependent on the US, even if they were going to buy our stuff. And as an American, I think that's a really good idea. If your military is dependent on another country's goodwill to function, you're not actually free to make your own choices. You're just stuck being a puppet. It feels communist, which means I am biologically obligated to take that idea for an enthusiastic walk.
Very enthusiastic walks.
So the Brits made the wise choice to negotiate an agreement to produce parts of the airframe and systems domestically and refit the Phantoms with British engines, which also happened to be more powerful and fuel efficient. The Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans were one of the first low-bypass turbofan engines, and I'll elaborate on why that matters. See, the J-79s on the Phantom were turbojet engines, which brought in air from the inlet to the compressor, lit it on fire, used the turbine to extract enough power to keep the engine spinning, and then spat out the rest. The Speys were turbofans, which add a fan in front of the compressor stages that is also driven by the turbine. The fan not only helps speed up the air going into the engine, but also a low ratio of additional air that goes around the engine instead of through it, literally bypassing the core of the engine. And by passing around the core, that air both cools the engine and absorbs energy, which translates to more thrust without spending more fuel. Let's say you have a house with a lawn, and for some reason the people who planted that lawn only had grass planted within a certain range of your house, so you just have a thick ring of dirt around the outside edge of your lawn. Maybe they were a ripoff, maybe they were drinking on the job, I don't know, you hired like a 2-star company because you're broke and you'll take what you can get.
No, it's fine, it doesn't bother me, it bothers me a lot.
You could fill it in with grass yourself, but remember, you're broke and that is expensive, so it just sits there and eats away at your property value. And then one day you find some kind of flower that will naturally spread itself into unplanted soil, so you pull together enough money to plant these flowers around the edge of your lawn. Over time, the plant grows and spreads, and soon the dirt ring is filled in. Your property value goes up, and all you had to do was buy something once. That is the value of using a turbofan engine versus a turbojet. You're literally just getting free real estate in the thrust economy.
It's free real estate.
And it is a considerable amount of thrust value. The Spey engine delivered 20,515 pounds of thrust in full afterburner instead of the 17,890 pounds of the original J-79s. And these engines faced into the deck at a much steeper angle because of the 40-inch nose strut, which was double the length of its American counterparts. No, the Phantom is not just happy to see you. Yes, this is the guy she tells you not to worry about. The sheer length of this erection caused a massive increase in the angle of attack on takeoff, which let the FG-1s take off from the Brits' smaller carriers. However, those carriers were not prepared for the raw thrust that was applied from their preferred position, because the Spey engines directed so much force into the carrier deck that the HMS Ark Royal eventually had to have its deck refitted with water-cooled steel plates because the Phantom's afterburners eventually melted through the deck. However, while the Speys were better than the J-79s, they were also bigger and needed more room, resulting in the expensive laundry list of modifications and increasing the size and drag of the airframe. So they got a nice little kick to acceleration and climb rates at low altitude in exchange for not going as fast or as high as the original Phantom Js. But they got that domestically produced engine, and I'm definitely cool with that because it helped them keep going long enough to make new engines for Grandpa Buff. The Royal Navy originally wanted 140 of the FG-1 Phantoms, but that order got cut down to 48 because the country's defense budget at the time was shrinking faster than your balls in the winter, and they couldn't afford the carrier upgrades they'd planned. 20 of those 48 FG-1s ended up getting transferred to the RAF later in 1968, before they actually received their Phantoms, the F-4Ms, aka the FGR-2s. These were delivered the following year and designed without all of those extra modifications required for carrier operations, like that giant third leg or the folding nose cone to fit them onto the flight elevators. RAF FG-1s and FGR-2s would double-fist their duties as ground pounders and interceptors until 1974, when the Sepacat Jaguars came along. The Jaguars were custom-made for the job of introducing the ground to various spicy things, so the Phantoms would in turn take over the job of reaching out and touching Soviet bombers from the BAC Lightnings. Then in 1978, the Royal Navy retired all of its fixed-wing carrier-capable naval aircraft except for the Harriers, and the RAF would receive all remaining FG-1s, upgrade them to FGR-2s, and replace the remaining Hawker Hunters, which I would imagine is quite the upgrade, going from chasing the sound barrier to telling it to kiss your ass. That's like going from economy seating to business class. You never want to go back. And now the RAF has enough planes to reach out and touch everybody, which is perfect because they were about to need it. Now, this isn't a Falklands War video, so I will try and turn this context into cliff notes.
You are do not. There is no try.
The story of the Falklands War started in 1976 when Argentinian military leaders completed a long-prepared coup, and the juntas, as they were called, took over the Argentinian government after a long period of social and economic instability. And as is usually the case with dictatorships, people got tired of that crap pretty quickly, so by the time the junta installed Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri as president in December of 1981, people were getting more and more dissatisfied with the military rule alongside economic issues, labor unrest, not feeding people, standard cockstarch problems. So what do you do if you're a dictator who can't feed people? That's right, you make them not care about not being fed by making them angry at something else. I feel like I've seen this somewhere before. Nah, probably just me. So naturally, he decides to pick a fight over something with Argentinian ancestry, those being the British-controlled Falkland Islands on April 2nd, 1982. While this would initially seem to work as morale would shoot up across the board and people would gather out front of the Argentinian presidential palace in support, they would quickly come to realize they'd made an extremely tactical error in judgment.
Bro, it's goof o'clock right now.
Don't get me wrong, I like to poke the 1776 jokes as much as the next American over, but at some point you gotta remember the British are America's dad, and the apple doesn't always fall far from the tree. I'm trying to tell you that the Argentinians are about to get a boot up the ass old man style, and I would say they're about to taste some leather, but back in his day they only wore steel toes. It was at this point that British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher would declare a 200 nautical mile war zone around the Falkland Islands, and the Brits would start figuring out where they were going to operate from. It's important to have a forward operating base in rough proximity to the theater for easy logistics, so the UK would turn to the Wide Awake airfield located on Ascension Island, which had been conjointly operated by the US and the UK after World War II. After getting US approval for complete access to the supplies and facilities located there, the UK would begin re-garrisoning the island starting that same month. And since you should always have stuff to protect your stuff, Phantom FGR-2s from the RAF 29th Squadron would begin arriving on Ascension Island on the 24th of May, where they would take over for Harrier jump jets in the Quick Reaction Alert or QRA mission. These Phantoms had two simple orders: turn around anybody who got within 200 nautical miles of the island, and show anybody within 100 nautical miles the door to the afterlife. No radio contact, no wait for confirmation, just get that blip off my radar scope and theirs.
Who's this
Is it just to get us
who just dropped into my grid square? Die!
This almost turned into a literal nightmare when a friendly Lynx helicopter took off from a Royal Navy frigate without telling anybody and flew into the island's kill zone. 29th was scrambled to intercept with direct orders to shoot it down, and while they were able to identify him in time and call it off, I doubt they were able to save him from needing new pants. However, that code brown was the majority of the Phantom's adrenaline rush during the war, and one of around 2 QRAs they ever flew. The Falklands War ended on June 14th, 10 weeks after it had started, and the junta government would collapse a few years later, but tensions don't settle immediately. Friendly relations between enemies are like wines, they take a bit to age and need to be contained before they can be cashed in. More Phantoms would be sent to RAF Port Stanley starting in October, and they'd be stationed in the Falklands for a while as a reminder to the Argentinians to chill out. But that chill factor caused another problem.
Cut off one head, 2 more shall take its place.
When I said earlier that the British had enough planes to reach out and touch everybody, that was both before the war and before they established a permanent Phantom base. They've actually put enough planes over there that for the time being, there's a gap in British aerial homeland defenses, and a few years gap is way more than the Soviet Union needs to launch a quick nuclear strike. In order to patch up that hole in their skies, they'd need more planes, but modern fighters like the F-14 and F-15 were way too expensive, and the US wasn't producing enough F-4Ss to sell. The third best option then was to get a bunch of old F-4Js and give them life extensions and the F-4S's radar upgrades. These short-term replacements were purchased in 1984 and called the F-4J UKs, or as the pilots just called them, the J's.
Your J's are mine!
And while the British Phantoms would stay on good terms with the US throughout the Cold War, not all of the Phantom flyers would end up being so cooperative. One of the decisions the US has regretted considerably in recent years is selling weapons to Iran, and the Phantoms probably weren't an exception. Beforehand, however, everything was fine, as it always is. Even while the Vietnam War was going on, the US was trying to contain Soviet expansion and influence across the world, and the Middle East was no exception. However, the US literally had their hands full being balls deep in tree-speaking land halfway across the planet and was in no position to fight in yet another region. So they figured the next best option was to arm the Shah of Iran so he could maintain relations with the Soviet Union on their behalf.
Greetings.
So So among other things, the US sold them 32 F-4Ds, which were delivered starting on September 8, 1968, and in March of 1971 they would begin additional deliveries of 177 F-4Es and 16 RF-4Es over the course of that decade. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least until that enemy is no longer the primary concern. We did this with the Japanese in World War I, enemies in World War II. We did it with both the Soviets and the Chinese in World War II, enemies for the Cold War and beyond. Then we did it with Iran, and in February of 1979, just after some of the last Phantoms were delivered, the Islamic Revolution would come out of not so left field and Ayatollah Khomeini would take over Iran. And then we'd do it again by backing Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, after which point they'd turn around and start raising gas prices. All I'm saying is at this point there better be a college textbook hidden in the Pentagon somewhere that just lists all the criteria for countries you should not sell weapons to. Aspirations to be a world power? Check. Ambitious figures at play? Check. Might be economically struggling? Check. Here, have some more guns.
I feel like I'm sitting at the airsofter's lunch table right now.
And this sale of Phantoms would actually prove to be a direct pain in the US's rear during Operation Eagle Claw, where US forces would attempt to rescue the remaining hostages taken by an angry horde on November 4th, 1979 when they stormed the US Embassy in Tehran. During this mission, the USS Nimitz would launch rescue helicopters, and both the Nimitz and Coral Sea would provide fighter air cover. Problem was, aboard these carriers were both F-14s and F-4s, planes that Iran also flew. And if they're flying the same planes, then the radar contacts are going to look roughly the same. I'm trying to tell you that unless the US wants to treat a war like a game of Yahtzee, their planes are going to have to identify each other visually.
You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
So unless you're feeling like a blackjack winner, this is pretty much going to be Vietnam all over again, and that was a mess. They're not doing that again. So what do you do to make a situation like that less of an issue? Right, you go back to the past and you find what worked, and the US dug up the old World War II pro strat of painting your planes with bright colors to tell them apart. So the planes of Carrier Air Wings, or CVWs 8 and 14 aboard the USS Nimitz and Coral Sea would make like a spy movie and doll themselves up for a night on the town on the go. Marine Corps F-4N Phantoms from VMFA 531, the Grey Ghosts, and VMFA 232, the Red Devils, stationed on the Coral Sea would receive invasion stripes, which has got to be the coolest name for a cosmetic I've ever heard. The Grey Ghosts would get a new skin with some sick yellow and black racing stripes on the wingtips, which are visible in these pictures taken by VMFA 531 during that deployment and sent to me by a member of the US Naval Institute. The Phantoms of the Red Devils would get a red stripe, the attack aircraft would get into the spooky season in the middle of April with orange pinstriping, and the planes aboard the Nimitz would get their own as well. However, the mission ultimately failed, resulting in the hostages having to escape by other means, and no Iranian aircraft ever had to get slapped by the power pay to win. However, Iranian Phantoms would see combat 6 months later when the Iran-Iraq War kicked off. And honestly, there is one operation where I have to give them credit for the size of their balls if nothing else. And that operation was the attack on the H-3 airfields on April 4th, 1981. The book reported the attack rationale is that the Iranians wanted to take out the majority of Iraqi air power in one big swing by bombing the airfields they were stationed at. Decapitation strike, War 101 type of move. You need to take away the enemy's nice things, and if you can take away all of their nice things at once, it's even better. But of course, there's a problem.
Of course.
The majority of the Iraqi Air Force was hosted at 3 Al-Walid air bases in southwestern Iraq, near the Jordanian border in a grid area referred to as H3. The point of that was to place their aircraft as far out of range of enemy strikes as possible, which is a good idea in concept until the Iranians whip out Colonel Bahram Hoshiar over here to turn that good idea into a flex. Hoshiar planned an attack mission that called for 8 Iranian F-4E Phantom pilots commanded by Major Fariola Baratpour to take off from the 3rd Tactical Air Base in Hamadan and fly deep into Iraqi territory and slap the air bases. Seems simple enough, except because they're basically on the other side of the country, they would have to take bomb-laden, fuel-hungry Phantoms 1,500 kilometers, or just over 900 miles, to the target, and then fly back the same distance. That is an 1,800 mile or 3,000 kilometer round trip, and such a long-distance flight they would need no fewer than 4 separate refueling stops.
Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks?
Dunkin'.
Oh.
Alright, cut him off. He doesn't get any more fuel.
But wait, it gets worse, because they also needed to avoid radar detection the entire time. And the only way to do that without stealth was to blend in with ground reflections. And since the refueling tankers leave a way bigger radar mark than the Phantoms, they would also have to refuel in the ground clutter, meaning the entire operation, F-4s and KC-135s, would have to take place at no higher than 150 feet off the ground. We already did a recreation of Sageburner way back in part 1 to show how ridiculous it is to pull off a supersonic flight run at 125 feet max. The Iranians might not be going Mach Jesus, but they were parking their tails under a flying building, which was also trying to stay below that altitude. For reference, the Phantom was nearly 16.5 feet tall, right? The KC-135 is just shy of 42 feet tall, and has a 48-foot boom arm when fully extended, which takes up another 32 feet of altitude when angled at 45 degrees. That only leaves you with about 70 feet of altitude to actually move around in. This was probably the only time they've ever thanked Allah for making sure their country was a giant f***ing sandbox with only 1% tree coverage, because the most common tree in Iran is the rubber tree, which grows to a minimum height of roughly 20 meters. That is 65 feet minimum. If these guys had any forestation in their flight path, they'd have better luck flying with wings made out of Agent Orange.
Breathe it in! Breathe it in!
If these guys get any lower to the ground, they're gonna start kicking up rocks and sand, worrying about ground effect, and somehow making sure the planes don't drive themselves into the earth under the titanic masses of these guys' nutsacks, and that's without worrying about other factors getting in the way. So to make sure their pilots can focus on multitasking between refueling and occupationally blue-balling the planet, multiple different aircraft would fly supporting roles. 2 F-14A Tomcats would use their ball cancer radars to watch for threats coming from Iraq's western borders. An RC-130H Kofosh early warning aircraft would check for incoming targets, and a Boeing 747 modified into an airborne command platform would monitor Iraqi communications, giving them the first clue if they got picked up. And just for good measure, 3 F-5E Tigers were sent in after an airbase in northern Iraq as a diversionary force.
Fight the enemy where they aren't.
From what I've been able to find, the attack went perfectly, and they caught the Iraqis completely by surprise and bombed out their air bases. Iran and Iraq naturally contest the claims of actual totals destroyed, but an independent analyst confirmed the destruction of 25 enemy aircraft, 3 transports, 12 fighters, 1 bomber, 4 ground attack planes, and 4 helicopters. And this mission is arguably made more impressive by the fact that only 40% of the Phantom fleet was considered operational by US standards when the Iran-Iraq War started. In fact, they were so desperate for functional fighters throughout the conflict that Iranian pilots would often fly their F-4s even if systems malfunctioned or failed to start altogether during takeoff, literally going in there on a wing and a prayer. I'm half convinced that's probably why I couldn't find any data for the number of Phantoms lost during the Iran-Iraq War. Nobody can tell the difference between a combat loss and a complete systems failure. Those Phantoms that did survive probably live off of prayers in Iran today, and while the third global user to acquire their Phantoms might also pray for success, they don't exactly have a habit of waiting for God to do all the work. Israel would order their first 50 F-4E Phantoms on December 27, 1968. I know they celebrate Hanukkah, but it feels a bit ironic that they also got themselves a Christmas gift. The Israelis would dub their Phantoms the Kurnass, or Sledgehammer, and they would be delivered starting on September 5, 1969, right into a baptism of fire. Back in March of that year, the Egyptians decided they were comfortable enough in their military rebuild to skip go and go straight to the find out part of the graph, kicking off the war of attrition and trying to retake territory lost during the Six-Day War 2 years prior. After hammering down some pesky nail guns, aka SAM sites, Israeli forces would quickly adapt to using the Kurnass's radar and missiles, eventually pulling off their own Operation Bolo called Operation Rimon 20. Basically, by this point in the war, the Soviets had joined up with the Egyptians and were directly covering Egyptian territory, and they began to directly attack Israeli aircraft entering that region. And the strategy that the IAF and its commander, Brigadier General Mordecai Madi Hod, came up with was to start dual wielding. The Israelis were going to simulate 2 different missions that had resulted in Soviet MiG attacks at the same time. One was a Mirage 3 high-altitude recon flight with 4 armed Mirages packed together tightly enough to look like 2 planes on radar like usual, but the other was a false A4 Skyhawk attack flight along the canal, with Kurnasses pretending to be A4s and 4 Mirages flying below them under radar coverage. Brigadier General Hod emphasized at the beginning that they were to take out as many of the enemy as possible, before leaving them with an ultimatum: show the Russians what Texas is. Do you understand how ridiculous that is? Like, I know Texas is the gun state, as an American, like that makes sense. But the fact that reputation has evolved into a stereotype so prominent that countries halfway across the planet can just hear its name and know exactly what they're about to do is absolutely wild to me. Now, in all honesty, Texas was what the Israeli pilots called the area southwest of Suez City, where they would keep knocking out Egyptian planes, basically turning the airspace into their own version of Mig Alley, and combined with the preference for aerial gunnery over missiles, causing them to style themselves as Wild West gunfighters. But still, the sheer eminence of the fact that this theme created by the US is just... I have no words. Let no one tell you the US doesn't have its own original culture, because I promise you just don't want to be the door it knocks on. This operation would go off without a hitch and 5 kills would be scored, 2 of which would be credited to Phantoms. The war of attrition would eventually end in September of 1970, and Israel would acquire more of the Kurnass, eventually totaling 204 airframes, which would have their greatest moment during the Yom Kippur War in 1973 in one of the first battles, the Battle of Ofira. On October 6, 1973, 2 Kurnass Phantoms flown by Captain Amir Nachumi and Daniel Shaki took on 28 Egyptian MiGs, 20 MiG-17s, and 8 MiG-21s, assembled from 4 different countries, literally jumping into 7-to-1 odds and coming off without a scratch.
Now stand aside, worthy adversary. 'Tis but a scratch.
Making this fight that much more impressive is the fact these pilots were only there to protect incoming civilian airliner flights, and were so inexperienced they were restricted to being wingmen. And just to top it all off, you know, the icing on the cake, when he was notified about the possibility of an impending attack the night before and called his squadron leader to get a flight leader on site, his squadron leader said, "Congratulations, you're a flight leader now," and hung up on him. I guess I'm just glad that we're not the only military that tells people to go do things they're not trained for. So after they get prepared, go to their Phantoms, and get ready to go, ground control would then order the 2 pilots to not take off unless the base came under attack, which is just an incredibly stupid idea. Like, sure, just wait until the bad guys are literally munching on your butt cheeks to be a sitting duck for a few more minutes while I speed up to start airbending. And so in frustration, Nachumi says, "At least tell me what's on the radar scope," to which the operator responds, "Honestly, I see 20 MiGs coming in over the sea."
Oh, okay.
Nachumi immediately calls for the engine kickstart. There are 20 confirmed aircraft from a hostile country on the way. He is not sticking around. Ground control hears the J-79 starting up, and they start yelling at Nachumi to follow orders and hold position, but like the gangster this man is already proving to be, he just unplugs the respective cable in the cockpit and taxis out. Both him and his wingmen get to the runway, punch the throttles all the way forward, and get off the ground literally seconds before the enemy bombs start slamming into the runway. They were so close to getting choke slammed into the planet that the enemy could actually see the 2 Phantoms in their gun cameras as they started their bomb runs. If they had listened to their superior officers, they would have been painted across a crater instead of being on their own against the 28 enemies now surrounding them.
I like those odds.
Luckily for them, the enemy force was made of piecemeal formations from different squadrons, were mostly equipped for ground attack, and not fighting over a friendly integrated air defense network, so the Phantoms had basically every advantage in the fight besides numbers. I'm trying to tell you that these Phantoms aren't looking at being outnumbered, they're looking at a target-rich environment. It's widely reported that by the end of the fight, 7 MiGs would go down in exchange for no Phantom losses, although closer analysis by Not a Pound for air-to-ground suggests 3 kills, with 3 lost to ground fire and 1 splashdown over the water due to unconfirmed causes, and I'll link that video below. But even with the combat over, the Kurnass still wasn't out of the woods because the Phantom's still a thirsty girl and they were about out of gas. 4 Mirage fighters joined them right as the fight ended, but they had flown the whole way in afterburner to get there in time, and consequently, they were also out of gas. And the runway had not only just been attacked, it had been attacked with cratering bombs, or bombs designed to pierce into the ground and then explode, basically turning the runway into the surface of the moon. So naturally, Nachumi immediately dons his plot armor and says over the radio, "I'm going to try to land." Because what he remembered was something he was taught during his conversion training to the Phantom, which was the reason why carrier aircraft like the Phantom always land like a beached whale. By coming down harder and using the reinforced landing gear to effectively bitch slap the planet, a plane will shed a metric ton of airspeed by directing that energy into the ground instead of forward, and shorten the landing distance. I'm trying to tell you this man is about to play the highest stakes game of patty cake with the planet, and he's about to win by beating the laws of physics into submission. So Nachumi comes down, down, slams the Phantom onto the end of the runway and holds down the brakes and comes to a stop right in front of a bomb crater.
Never mind, we're back in business.
The Yom Kippur War would come to an end on October 25th of that year, but the Kurnass would be used again in 1982 during Operation Mole Cricket 19 alongside the Israelis' Kafirs, F-15s, and F-16s to take out SAM sites. All told, the Kurnass Phantoms would earn a total of 116 air-to-air victories over their service life to 55 losses, 32 of those being during the Yom Kippur War and mostly due to SAM. And after all that service, practice, and familiarity, it's no wonder that Israel decided to upgrade and modify their Phantoms over time. In 1980, Israel considered making a modification program to keep the Kurnass Phantoms going into the next century. The Kurnass 2000s would modernize the existing Kurnass fleet with Pratt & Whitney PW1120 turbofan engines, along with new avionics, an AN/APG-76 radar, and standardized support for standoff munitions. The upgrades were designed for the entire Kurnass fleet and first declared operational on April 9, 1989, although the engines were not included due to one reason:
Money!
Then, as if upgrading a living legend wasn't enough, there was also an attempt made at a Super Phantom, collectively between General Dynamics and Israeli Aerospace Industries, better known as the F-4X program. Basically, the Israelis wanted the HAIC-1 high-altitude long-range oblique photography cameras that could clearly make out objects 20 centimeters in size at a distance 20 nautical miles away, so they didn't have to run recon missions low enough to get smoked by SAM batteries. The Israelis were only able to use this technology in existing capacities via the big, bulky 4,000-pound G139 pods, which could be slung onto an F-4 Phantom centerline pylons. So what do you do if your American plane is weighed down and you want it to go faster? That's right, you give it more thrust.
Power and speed solves many things.
The plan was to take a Phantom and install 300-gallon conformal water tanks mounted on top of the intakes. These would inject a mix of demineralized water vapor and methanol into the airflow in the engine compressor stages, which would do three things. One, it would cool the air entering the engine, making it more dense and causing it to suck more air in to compensate, which increases thrust. Two, it would increase the amount of material or mass flowing through the engine, which also increases thrust. And three, it would increase the amount of oxygen in the airstream, which increases the richness of the fuel burn, increasing thrust. If you're not picking up what I'm putting down, what I've basically just described to you is a nitrous injection, okay? General Dynamics figured out how to put a nitrous injection onto a plane that already had more thrust than its pilots knew what to do with. This would provide an estimated 50% increase in thrust output, and when the US developed a smaller version of the camera in 1973, they realized it was small enough to put in the nose, meaning that it didn't have to carry the G139 pod anymore, which meant the Super Phantom would have a top speed of about Mach 3.2. Do you understand what I've just told you? The Phantom already moves fast enough to give the sky a sunburn. Now it's going to give the speed of sound an existential crisis. If you thought Mach 2 was fast, this thing is going to be fast enough to punch a hole in reality. And the idea of putting that in somebody else's hands is a little bit concerning, especially after Israel used their Phantoms to threaten the United States. In August of 1970, towards the end of the War of Attrition, Israel detected a pair of U-2 spy planes and threatened to shoot them down because they had supposedly deviated out of the 5-kilometer wide corridor that the Israelis demanded the US fly in. And I'm no pilot, but a 3-mile wide space for a plane like the U-2 with a good 100-foot wingspan doesn't seem like a whole lot of wiggle room. Also, this is America in the 1970s. We go where we please and you can fight us about it.
7th rule. Fights will go on as long as they have to.
And since that's exactly what Israel wanted to do, the last thing we're gonna do is sell them a top-of-the-line weapon to do it with. So the only way the US was going to allow General Dynamics to complete and sell their work was if the new Phantom was a recon variant only. Once that was clear, development continued until roughly around 1975, when the program was dropped. And that raises the question of why. Why would you stop making a fighter jet with nitrous? Because the Israelis don't really believe in a Cold War. When they fight, they mean it. And so if they became the third country in the world to have a Mach 3 plus plane made on a fighter chassis that you could probably modify into an interceptor again, the odds of them becoming a cause for global destabilization of the Cold War were a bit too high. Not to mention, the cooling system would actually cause the compressor blades to expand, rubbing up against the walls of the compressor stage and literally shredding the engine.
Engine fire right. Extinguishing right engine.
And since that feels a little contradictory, I'm going to elaborate on my best guess as to why that happened. Solid materials like metal are supposed to shrink slightly when cooled, not expand. They only do that when exposed to heat, so where is the extra heating coming from? Well, it's important to understand that only the air was being cooled, not the compressor blades, and it turns out there's a reason why nitrous only gets used in short bursts. The PW1120 engines were a downsized version of the soon-to-be Eagle's F100 engines, and the compressor stage was designed for sustained normal flow, not for extensive exposure to the cooled and much more condensed airflow in a long-term nitrous shot. Because the airflow is more condensed, that means there's more air for the blades to fight through, which means there's more friction for the blades to fight through. Now the blades are heating up more than they were designed for, causing them to expand and do all that illegal rubbing. Add this issue to the F-15 program itself, which was about to become operational and required funding that the F-4X program might steal. The F-4X was expected to be faster, higher flying, and potentially cheaper, although less capable, than the F-15, which offered more benefits right off the production line in turn. But the cheaper part is the keyword. You can't have a cheaper alternative without Congress asking questions, and those taxpayer dollars aren't going to spend themselves, so the F-4X program had to go. However, the Israelis would still get a Recon Phantom in the end, or more specifically, 3 of them. In 1976 and 77, Israel would receive the new RF-4ES, eventually just labeled the F-4ES, which were 3 F-4Es converted to use the new high-altitude cameras in the nose. These were nicknamed the Salam Shablul, or photographer snails, which I am 90% convinced was made just to throw some shade at the US for not letting them have their flying infinity stone. The F-4ES would serve in recon missions at altitudes of up to 70,000 feet until 2004, when all 3 would be removed from service and placed either in storage or a museum. And while those Phantoms probably had some long stories to tell, the remaining 8 countries that flew Phantoms didn't. Some countries also had modifications, some just let them sit there, some didn't even permanently own them, so let's go through the rest of these by year of delivery. First of all, South Korea. The Republic of Korea would be the 4th nation to get Phantoms in hand, receiving 6 F-4Ds in late 1969, nice, and would eventually have 92 of them. They would also decide to pick up on the F-4D/F-4E combo that the Air Force had tried out with the combat tree during Linebacker, and starting in September 1977, 94 F-4Es would also begin to arrive, followed by 27 RF-4Cs in 1989. South Korea also has the unique distinction of purchasing the 5,075th and last Phantom produced in the United States, an F-4E. In contrast to the South Koreans getting the last one, though, Australia would never actually own Phantoms in the first place, despite being one of the earlier operators. Back in 1968, the Australians were supposed to receive the F-111C aardvarks, but when initial deliveries were completed that year, structural defects were found that required a 5-year redesign. However, this left a gap in the ground pounder force, and they set out to find a replacement. They would eventually choose the F-4E Phantoms over the A-6 Intruders and the Blackburn Buccaneers because it had actually gone to war and was doing work there in the exact role they needed it to. Obvious decision. So in June 1970, Australia and the US reached a leasing agreement where they would basically borrow 24 brand new F-4E Phantoms until the F-111s were ready. I'm trying to tell you the Australians have just invented Rent-A-Jet and it's with frickin' Phantoms. I know that a lot of civilian innovations were inspired by military uses, but man, talk about a curveball. Delivery of the Phantoms would be completed by October of that same year, and within 6 months of the agreement being made, not only had the air crews assigned to the program fully converted from their F-111 training to the F-4, but the Australians had 2 whole squadrons operational, which is absolutely nuts because 6 months is about the time it takes to clear basic flight training. It takes roughly 3 to 4 years for the US to make a brand new fighter pilot right now, and the Australians got all of that training and setup done in 6 months. Not only have the Australians just invented Rent-A-Jet for the military, they've done it in less time than it takes Congress to agree on a national budget. After being returned to the US between November 1972 and June 1973, most of those F-4Es were refitted into F-4Gs or QF-4 target drones. And honestly, now it makes perfect sense that some of those F-4Gs would fight through Desert Storm, because we all know that anything that comes out of Australia is a whole different breed of whatever it is. Doesn't matter if it's planes, wildlife, or people, they are just built different.
I'm just built alternatively, constructed alternatively.
Constructed in an unorthodox fashion.
Built stupid.
Spain was the 6th Phantom owner to get some, specifically some F-4Cs, or as they called them, C-12s. 36 would start arriving in February 1971, with 4 more in 1978. That same year, 4 RF-4Cs called CR-12s would also arrive, with 8 more sent over in 1989. And these Phantoms would sit around and do a whole lot of nothing until they were replaced with the Eurofighter. Meanwhile, Japan's Phantoms, first ordered in 1968 wouldn't see combat either, but they would leave behind a much more cultural impact. The first of 140 F-4EJs arrived on July 25th, 1971, being different from the base F-4Es in that they didn't have ground attack capabilities. They were declared operational in 1973, and because the Japanese also negotiated a domestic production agreement, only the first two F-4EJs were produced in the US. And when I stated earlier that the 5075th Phantom the South Koreans got was the last one produced, there was a reason I specified in the US, because Japan would produce roughly another 120 Phantoms domestically after US production lines had shut down.
Never back down, never what?
When 1984 rolled around, Japan also elected to extend the lifespan of its Phantom fleet, and began the Aircraft Structural Integrity Program to modernize 96 Phantoms into F-4EJ Kais. These integrated a new AN/APG-66J radar based off the one used in the F-16, new avionics, ground attack abilities, and anti-ship missiles, but they didn't wire it for AMRAAMs like some of the other global owners. The Japanese would also order 14 RF-4E Phantoms as were, which were delivered from 1974 to 1975. Then, when they started receiving F-15Js, rather than get rid of some of the older and excess Phantoms, they decided to repurpose them, converting a total of 15 F-4EJs and EJ Kais into RF-4EJ versions, which kept the chin-mounted Mystifier 6000s instead of the nose-mounted cameras. And as I mentioned, while they would not see combat, this plane would evolve into Japan's version of the F-14 in the United States, becoming an icon in both movies and their cultural signature, anime. Not only would the 301st Squadron and 501st Reconnaissance Squadron flying out of Hyakuri Base produce a short video of flight footage matched to the soundtrack for the Top Gun Maverick trailer, but the Phantoms would take up places in a few military-themed anime. These were as old as Area 88 or as limited as the one-off called Third Girl's Aerial Squadron. But arguably the best depiction of the Phantom in anime that I've seen is in one called Gate, where some Phantom pilot starts showing a freaking dragon who the dominant aero form is, and then gets shoot out back in base because the hotshot Lieutenant Wingman decided to go head-on with its fire breath.
Real nice job, ladies.
It even has an Apocalypse Now reference. Moving on to West Germany, the 8th Phantom Flyer. They would actually receive the Recon E's first, and the way I said that makes me think that should be what they call the jargon used by their pilots. Terrible jokes aside, 88 RF-4Es first entered service on January 20th, 1971, with deliveries completed by the end of May of next year. A single one of these was later modified for electronic intelligence under the Peace Trout program, and a year after the last Recon Phantom was delivered, they would start getting their own unique Phantoms, the F-4Fs. By the early 70s, Germany was getting real sick and tired of the government corruption garbage that was their F-104G starfighters, which were also just getting old. But they couldn't replace them with newer stuff yet because it looked like the new Panavia Tornadoes were going to be delayed, so they were going to need a replacement. Germany chose to negotiate a contract with Old McDonald's Aircraft Farm that would let them domestically produce parts of a new low-cost version of the Phantoms, which would dumb down the avionics and do away with the Sparrows entirely, which by default probably made it the most efficient Phantom on the 70s block. The 175 Phantom Fs were first delivered to the Luftwaffe on September 5th, 1973, and all were present and accounted for by April of 76. Then they would also get a modernization package because they needed advanced missile capabilities, and they were dealing with another delay, this time with the Eurofighter program. If I had a nickel for every time Germany needed Phantoms to cover a delay in their aircraft programs,
I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
So in 1983, Germany started the Improved Combat Efficiency Program to provide a lifespan overhaul and avionics upgrades for 156 Phantom airframes. Then they would go a step further and install AN/APG-65 radars made for the F-18s and AIM-120 AMRAAMs on 113 of those 156, just in case the program's acronym wasn't clear to anyone stupid enough to be on the receiving end of it.
Awesome.
The 9th Phantom customer would be the Greeks, ordering 36 F-4Es in 1972 under the Peace Icarus program, first arriving in 1974. And much like the vindictive partner in a couple out at dinner, the Turkish would look at that and loudly go, "Actually, I'll have that too," and then proceed to smugly one-up them with an extra flight by ordering 40 F-4Es, also in 1972, and also receiving them in 1974. Greece would then mutter, "You under its breath and buy 18 more F-4Es and then throw in 8 RF-4Es for extra measure on July 16, 1977. Naturally, even thinking of one-upping them, let alone actually daring to do it, makes the Turks absolutely furious, so they go overboard and buy 32 more F-4Es and 8 RF-4Es of their own, receiving the 5,000th Phantom produced in the process. After seeing the Greeks sit there and not making a counteroffer, they decide to rub it in and go on a full Phantom shopping spree until their Air Force looks like an episode of Hoarders. buying another pack of 15 retired Phantoms, then another 15, then they get bolder and buy a pack of 40, and then another pack of 40 after the Greeks accepted an offer from the US to trade 28 more used F-4Es for a basing agreement extension. Then when Germany retired its RF-4Es from 1992 to 94, it put the ownership pie on the table between the two of them. Again, Turkey steals the biggest slice of the pie for themselves, getting 32 RF-4Es as they glare across the table and dare the Greeks to try and contest them with their 20. After this, the Turkish realize that no amount of Phantoms can save them if they're all decrepit and crumbling, so they award a contract to Israeli Aerospace Industries, or IAI, to upgrade 54 F-4Es with the Kurnass 2000 package in August 1995. Greece sees this and they're like, that's it, that's a bridge too far, I'm getting my own upgrade package. So they start taking offers, immediately reject IAI because they're helping Turkey, and sign a contract of their own for 36 of their Phantoms to get the ICE upgrade package from the Germans and Daimler-Benz on August 11, 1997. 2 years later to the month. And that's the story of how we got the Greek Peace Icarus 2000s versus the Turkish Terminator 2020s. And if you ask me, it sounds like I've just found the perfect opportunity to make another shitty reality TV rom-com. Call it All's Fair in Love and War with a PH.
Those two should just date already!
And now that I'm done playing the gossip game, I can get to the 11th and final Phantom Flyer. Egypt. Yes, the country that Israel spent the better part of the late 60s and 70s trying to obliterate. And yes, it feels weird to think the Israelis might have almost as much to do with the Phantom's entire history as the United Damn States. And in this case, Israel is actually the reason the Egyptians got Phantoms. When the US brokered the Camp David Agreement in 1978 to put an end to the military hostilities between the Egyptians and the Israelis, their Arab backers took great exception to that because they saw it as Egypt selling out. And those backers were responsible for funding Egypt's defense budget.
Oh man, they have to hate us.
They do. That's why they cancelled our budget.
Ooh, that's bad. We need that, right? Walter, we need that, right?
Yes, very important.
Thank you, Walter.
Of course, sir.
And among the cancelled items was an upcoming fighter deal for 50 F-5s that Saudi Arabia had planned on purchasing and then giving to the Egyptians. Now lacking in fighter aircraft, the US would then make an agreement with the Egyptians called Peace Pharaoh, where they traded them 35 second-hand F-4E Phantoms starting in September of 1979 in exchange for some of their MiG-21s and MiG-23s, which we would analyze extensively before probably sticking in a museum somewhere. First make sense out of it, then make dollars out of it. It's the American way. However, the Egyptians actually hated the Phantoms at first. The pilots and mechanics were used to the finer things in Soviet life, aka easy maintenance. So going over to the Phantom was like getting whiplash on a career scale. I mean, let's face it, American aircraft are made to win world wars, not save the taxpayers' money, and by 1982, the Egyptians were seething over getting stuck on hardcore mode. So bad they were about to rage quit and sell them to Turkey in exchange for F-16s. Most likely not wanting any part of the rom-com going on in that part of the world, the US Air Force led a maintenance improvement project that brought back their readiness and serviceability rates, and these had improved enough by 1985 to convince Egypt to keep their Phantoms, and receive another 7 second-hand F-4Es in 1988 on top of it. The F-4 Phantom was also the only plane that both the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds flew, with the Blue Angels flying F-4Js and the Thunderbirds flying F-4Es until 1974. However, in 1974, the gas crisis hit the US, and the entire country started scrambling to limit gas consumption and improve production in all forms. And the Phantom was always notoriously thirsty, so it had to be phased out of both demo teams, being replaced by the A-4 Skyhawks for the Blue Angels and the T-38 Talons for the Thunderbirds. Sadly, the Phantom was also just as much of a hazard to the ground crews as it was to gas prices, because a lot of its materials were made with asbestos. In fact, it was used in so many places that ground crews ran the risk of exposure when working with the engine insulation and heat shields, electrical wiring, brake systems and lining, cockpit heating systems, torque valves, gaskets, parts of the fuselage and landing gear, or even the sealants and adhesives. And that's not even counting the protective gear that could contain asbestos to protect crews from the Phantom's parts. As a result of that time and technology, most operators would begin to phase out their last Phantoms in the late 90s and 2000s.
I didn't want this.
The US Navy and Marine Corps would retire their last Phantoms in the early 1980s, while the Air Force would keep their last ones until 1996. The Nevada Air National Guard finally retired their RF-4Cs the year prior, and rare footage of their final flights was captured in a documentary posted over on the Extreme Mysteries channel, which I will link in the description below. The US would keep roughly 50 QF-4 unmanned target drones for air-to-air and surface-to-air missile tests for a while past this point, but the last of those was retired on December 21st, 2016. The US retirements would be followed by the British in 1992, the Spanish in 1989 with their F-4 F-4Cs, and in 2002 with their RF-4Cs, and Israel in 2004. Germany would finish retiring their RF-4Es in 1994 and the F-4Fs on June 29, 2013. Egypt's F-4Es in 2018, Japan's F-4EJs and Kais on November 20th, 2020, and South Korea's last Es and Ds would leave service officially on June 7, 2024. And that isn't even everybody. Greece, Turkey, and Iran are still flying their Phantoms to this day.
For someone who was never meant for this world, I must confess, I'm suddenly having a hard time leaving it.
There were 5,195 Phantoms manufactured in the world total, and each 1,000th Phantom was commemorated by ceremony, and the date of that ceremony was recorded. The 1,000th Phantom, a US Navy F-4B, was delivered on June 7, 1965. The 2,000th Phantom, a US Air Force F-4D, was delivered on February 21, 1967. The 3,000th Phantom, a US Navy F-4J, was delivered on August 8, 1968. The 4,000th Phantom, a US Air Force F-4E, was delivered on February 1, 1971. And the 5,000th Phantom, a Turkish F-4E, was delivered May 24th, 1978. Many of these Phantoms are preserved in museums all over the world, from the United States to many of its allies, even in places as far away as the Czech Republic, and that one actually has a cool story behind it. A Phantom FGR-2 with serial number XT899 was donated to the Aviation Museum of the Czech Armed Forces in the early 1990s. It was flown to the Kabel airfield on the 16th of January 1992, not only to rebuild ties between Czechoslovakia and Britain after the fall of the Iron Curtain, but also in memory of one of their star World War II pilots. During World War II, a Czechoslovak Air Force pilot by the name of František Doležal had escaped the fall of Czechoslovakia to fight the Germans with the French Air Force. And when France fell, he escaped to Britain and was attached to the 19th Squadron, where he got the nickname Dolly. He would later be placed in command of the famed 310th Squadron, made of escaped Czech pilots who fought for Britain to defeat the Germans. Doležal would survive the war, but he was later killed in a flying accident on October 4th, 1945, just a few months later. And when 19th Squadron was rotated to a reserve role in 1992 and began removing its Phantoms from service, they donated their last Phantom to Czechoslovakia in his memory. It would undergo a thorough renovation process in 2018 and was placed in the largest exhibition hangar of the VHU Aviation Museum, where it remains today. However, for all the damage the Phantom wreaked upon the enemy, I'd said before the Phantom's biggest impact was on the lives it saved, and even out of combat, that was true. Because as it turns out, the Phantom was so adaptable it could even serve the role of medevac. On December 22nd, 1985, in Fargo, North Dakota, a 4-month-old child named Michael McCann would pass away. His parents, while still shattered by the loss, made the very powerful decision to make their son an organ donor. And what they didn't realize at the time was that in Stanford University Medical Center in California, at the same time, a 5-month-old boy, Andrew De La Pena, was in urgent need of a heart transplant. At 11:45 p.m., the transplant team would recover Michael's heart and start the countdown. They had to get this heart halfway across the country, a distance spanning 1,800 miles, or a little shy of 3,000 kilometers. That is the same distance, round trip, the Iranians had to travel during the attacks on H3. For perspective, that is almost 3 times the north to south span of Germany across the United States. And they had to travel that distance in 4 hours. They rushed the heart to a medical Learjet, which kicked off its startup procedure and began preparing for takeoff. But one of the engines wouldn't start. With no other options left, the transplant team decided to bank on a literal shot in the dark and called the governor of North Dakota. And to their surprise, there was one option left. At the North Dakota Air National Guard base in Fargo sat F-4 Phantoms on their usual 24-hour home alert status, a more than sufficient substitute. Not even 1 minute later, Phantom pilot and First Lieutenant Robert J. Becklund started preparing for a very different kind of scramble. After grabbing maps in the transplant cooler, he would sprint out to his topped-up Phantom, start the engines, and move. And I would have paid to have been at the end of the runway when that Phantom took off, because knowing the circumstances, that roar must have sounded better than any other Phantom howl as Becklund shook the buildings on his way out. By the time the sun came up on the West Coast, the transplant had already been completed, and the young Andrew De La Pena, today in his 20s, would live. So in summation, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of reasons why the Phantom remains one of the most revered, admired, and recognized airplanes in the world today. The planes, the pilots, the achievements, the legacy. To commemorate that legacy and the time I've spent covering it, I will be hosting a giveaway of 3 laser-cut wooden plaques displaying an F-4 Phantom and its nickname, the largest distributor of MiG parts, which were given to the channel by an anonymous donor. This giveaway will be done live on Twitch next Saturday, March 22nd, and started around 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I will be live with some announcements before then. In order to enter this giveaway, you will need to be subscribed to my YouTube, following me on Twitch and be able to talk in my chat, and in the Adventurers Guild's official Discord, which is linked on the homepage of their website. Both my Twitch channel and the Guild website are linked in the descriptions of any of my airplane videos, and I'll leave them up here on my screen for you as well. No need to worry about shipping costs, but unfortunately that also means I'm gonna need to limit the giveaway to being US only, so I do apologize to my international viewers. I'm just gonna have to figure out something a lot cooler for all of you. One last thing, I am going back to making more plane videos on this channel. I'll still be posting gaming shorts here, but for longer gaming content, I will be setting up a VOD channel soon, where I will upload the unedited recordings of past streams, so you guys can catch up on the action, even if you can't make it over to Twitch on my usual days. This was one of the rewards I promised in Operation Spadathon, an event I ran on Twitch a few weeks ago, which received an overwhelming amount of support from all of you guys. Huge shout out to Nebula Cypher for his part in that, and thank you to all of you for not only helping me keep this channel running, but giving me the opportunity to keep doing what I enjoy, and collecting knowledge that is easier to understand into one place for people like all of you to come and see. So thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And if this is your first time here, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismiss.